Good afternoon, my name is Jennifer Gomez-Molina and I'm the co-chair of the Offshore Renewables Special Interest Group. A big welcome to our committee members here today and also our members joining on the live stream and in due course. Echo. I'm delighted to present Emma Pinchbeck, the Deputy CEO of RenewableUK, who is here presenting to us how we can decarbonise our energy sector and the challenges, the cost challenges and policy challenges that we face, and how we can establish ourselves as a global market leader. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. Apologies to those of you joining on the live stream. I am slightly late and also out of breath. The reason for that is twofold. I was actually with the London Authority this morning talking about how even local authorities are now looking to buy directly into renewables because they are so cheap, and it's very rude to stand up the mayor, so he kept me. And secondly, and relatedly, I'm pregnant and I have a cold, so forgive me if I'm sniffing and or looking exhausted. It is not because I am underwhelmed by renewables, it is because I'm underwhelmed by running around in high heels. Just to give you a quick bit of background, I am the Deputy CEO of RenewableUK. That means that whilst I am an expert in many things, I have smart people who work for me, so any detailed or technical questions I can't answer, I have a team that will do, so we'll log them and we'll come back to you on them if for some reason I can't answer the finer points of the engineering of an ASAP. And secondly, for those of you who don't know, RenewableUK is the largest trade body for renewable energy in the country, and we grew up out of being the wind, wave and tidal trade body. So we were originally a group for scientists and engineers to get together and talk about this brand new technology, wind, and what it may do. We had our 40th anniversary last year, and now rather than thinking about ourselves as a pusher of individual technologies, we are instead the kind of advocate for the future of the electricity system in the UK. And the reason I say that and what I want to talk to you about today is that there is now absolutely no question that large-scale renewables will be incumbent on the system by 2030. That is not the position of a renewables advocate, that is the position of the energy sector. And in the UK, we have a world-leading market and world-leading wind resource, so predominantly that will be offshore and hopefully onshore wind. As an organisation as well, because of that rapid ramp-up in the industry, we are now over 50% supply chain companies working in everything from marine diving through shipping, right the way to engineers, energy suppliers and the national grid. So we've become increasingly diverse and work on many more issues than just wind alone. And I've been asked to flag this with you, which is that if you're interested in anything I say today and you'd like to come and meet the industry and you don't know about this, it's our big global conference in June in London in the ExCeL, and that's really where the supply chain comes together with the industry as it exists already. There's a lot of B2B networking and speeches like this one that will tell you about the sector and the industry and the opportunities and challenges ahead. I just heard that the Governor of Massachusetts is coming over to speak alongside the Energy Minister, which gives you a sense of how important the market is in the UK for now, what is a global transformation. And the other thing is that all of the data I'm going to show you comes from our own project intelligence tracker. Only our members have access to this, so I'm sorry, it's why I'm only showing you a screen grab, but members of the organisation can see the entire pipeline, including a lot of our marine energy components, so things like O&M bases or ships, and I'm going to show you some of that in what we do. If you have any questions about our data, do get in touch after this presentation. And again, detailed questions, I can refer you to our economists and our analysts back at headquarters. Right, so I want to start by talking to you about the UK market potential. I said at the beginning of this that renewables would be incumbent by 2032. That's based on two things. Firstly, the top-down pressure of the carbon budgets in the UK. So that 2032 date comes from the 5th carbon budget, which is a legislated target in the UK, and unlike many of our other carbon targets, the power sector is on course to deliver. This is the target before we may tighten it for 1.5 rather than 2 degrees, so it's likely to get more ambitious than this even. But in every scenario going forward, what you need to know is that from National Grid, the Committee on Climate Change, the government's own forecasts, and now the industry's forecasts, renewables are incumbent. And this chart here is just a kind of back of the envelope piece of analysis. Our economist did, where she pulled all the major and credible energy scenarios that government uses and looks at. And what this clearly shows you is that we're looking at a grid dominated by variable renewables in the next decade. The second thing to say is that has been completely borne out by the market, and in fact the market is often moving forward faster towards this sort of picture for the system than the government or National Grid or any central body had predicted. So there's a caveat on that around onshore wind, but for offshore wind, things like electrification of transport, anything that is being driven by the market where we can see a kind of big demand, we would expect progress to happen even more quickly. And it's been driven, which is good news for engineers, largely by rapid technology innovation. I'm sure many of you might find this patronising. I have no idea what the audience is, but this is our classic graph for educating people about the size of wind turbines. And the other thing I always say is that as a millennial, I can't, if I try and Instagram a wind turbine from underneath it, I can no longer get a wind turbine into the standard kind of, there are people in the room that are going, yeah, this is a genuine problem. You can't get the top of a wind turbine into your camera on your phone anymore. They are so big. We have 10 megawatt turbines in operation now. They came forward this year with a kind of update to the 9 megawatt model, which is getting 10 megawatts out now. That megawatt figure is usually a combination of tweaking things like the nacelle and the kind of operational efficiency to get more megawatts out, but then also an increase in scale. My understanding is that the CFD bids that went in last year, so the ones that delivered very low pricing for projects that are delivering in the early 2020s, have factored in 10 megawatt plus turbines. They are assuming they will have access to the largest set of turbines that you can see on here. There are interesting constraints and impacts on the supply chain of that kind of technology progression as well. So every time we go up a size in wind turbine, naturally we need bigger vessels. We need sometimes bigger molds, bigger factories, bigger everything in order to get this kind of kit away. But it has delivered absolutely astonishing cost reductions. So these are the cost reductions from the last set of auctions for offshore wind. There's a typo actually on this slide, I've just spotted. The price that came out of the last auction is £57.50 per megawatt hour. That was for the cheapest project in the auction. The strike prices ranged from £57.50 to around £70 per megawatt hour. We are currently bidding in for an auction at the moment, the results of which we expect in September. We expect that price to come down again. For context, the target that the government set the industry was to be below £100 per megawatt hour in their strike prices before 2020. So they smashed that target by almost half, and they did it 4 years ahead of schedule. That tells you again how quickly the innovation is happening in the industry. Now, I said that most of those cost savings were delivered by the change in the turbines and kind of engineering efficiency, for want of a better word, and technology innovation. But it has also been that we've grown an industry around those turbines now. We know how to do operations and maintenance much more efficiently. We know how to build projects efficiently, we know how to finance them efficiently, we've got lawyers that know how to do all the legals efficiently, so some of those cost savings have also had a big impact. And this is data taken directly from that project intelligence data set I talked to that we own at RenewableUK, and this shows you the pipeline potential that we can see. So this is stuff that we can see in development, in planning, that has got consent and broken down. And essentially, we can see already nearly 40 gigawatts of offshore wind projects that are in planning or development in the UK. The industry has committed to at least 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So it's going to be, again, an astonishing ramp up. We're at around 10 gigawatts now, for context. Just checking, we will circulate all these slides as well, because I'm rattling through them. And the important thing is to say that the UK is a massive market in what is now a global trend. So the UK is fortunate because we have some of the best wind resources in the world, and we have a relatively accessible seabed and good coastline as an island, which means that our offshore wind industry can expect to be strong has been strong and will continue to be strong. And we also have the potential to have a very strong onshore wind industry and carry on building that. I'll come back to that later. And indeed, we have potential to do marine power, so wave and tidal stream, tidal lagoons. We are currently the world leader in that technology in the UK as well. Now, I say that because there is a global move to decarbonise, and there is a global move to invest in renewables technologies. And the UK, even in the context of so much of the market now being in Asia Pacific, can expect to own a big piece of that pie. Interestingly, UK companies exported to around 60 countries last year, so the fact that we've built an industry here isn't just about domestic growth, but also taking the opportunity in these markets. And so much of my job now with the Department of International Trade is talking to companies in Asia Pacific and the Americas about our European companies and our UK companies moving over there, sharing expertise, sharing products and services. And on the subject of products and services, the thing that I am proudest of about this industry is it is innately decentralised, so it is all around the UK, we go wherever the natural resources are, and we're managing to build on expertise we already had, having always been a country that invests in energy engineering and those skill sets. We are managing to move over from oil and gas to renewables, from coastal expertise in a marine industry and deploying that in our offshore wind sector. And that's happening all over the UK. And our offshore wind sector alone is now one of the country's biggest infrastructure projects. So it used to be 10 years ago that when you talked about renewables, you were normally talking about climate change or decarbonisation, or investing in these technologies for some kind of social or environmental good. And the conversation over the last 2 years, partly driven by that cost reduction, has instead been, this is just low-cost energy. It's the cheapest form of brand new energy generation that we have. But secondly, there are enormous industrial benefits to being an early mover into investing in this in your country, and indeed then follow on export benefits. So at the moment, because this isn't a big year for build, offshore wind is in the top 10 UK infrastructure projects. Next year, when we will be in the construction phase of many of our new project sites, we'll be top 3. We have been consistently top 10 for the last 5 years. And what's really good about that investment is over 90% of it goes outside the southeast of England. So this is going into regions and into coastal communities. And as if by magic, this is the map of our marine supply chain. So I've asked our team to pull from our data set where our biggest offshore and marine projects are. And as you can see broadly, the story for offshore wind is that it's straight down the east coast and all the way down and kind of around London. That's for fairly obvious reasons to do with where we had existing port infrastructure, where it was easy to build, where it was a kind of accessible coastline, but also where we had our highest wind speeds. We're expecting to build out the next phase up into the northeast of England and Scotland, so we will see what the Crown Estate, who owns and leases the seabed, comes back with. I think it's entirely possible that they're going to start broadening sites out as well around the UK. The eventual size of the pipeline in the UK for renewables could be anything up to 90 gigawatts, according to the latest advice. And if you think about that logically, it's going to get quite cramped up in the northeast if we try and do all of it there. So I think we're going to see more sites coming around the coast. That said, and just to flag our wave and tidal industry again, where that has largely developed and where those demo sites and projects are is actually on the west coast. So they're predominantly in Wales and in the southwest. So we've got a kind of coast-to-coast energy portfolio. For onshore wind, which is probably less interesting to you on this call, I would assume, but for onshore wind, we're largely got the best wind resource up in Scotland and in Wales, and that's where we would expect to do our newer sites going forward. Hopefully, you're all sitting closer to a screen than I am, and you can see these little blue dots. This is just an example of where investment has gone, and these are current O&M bases, so hubs for transport and logistics out to the construction and then the operation and maintenance of our existing offshore wind sites. The really big beneficiaries historically have been the east of England, where there are now huge offshore hubs for the supply chain, but increasingly in the northeast of England, And over on the East Coast, we're starting to see more and more investment in permanent operational bases here. And things like associated key infrastructure and so on. One of the amazing things for me, again, about this sector is a lot of those areas are parts of the UK that desperately needed investment, and or areas which used to have very strong fishing industries or indeed energy industries where they had the existing kind of port infrastructure, key infrastructure, some skill sets which have been given a second lease of life. And many of our vessel operating companies are former fishing fleets, interestingly, that have turned over. They're much better advocates for this industry than I think I am, but there you go, you're stuck with me. And another really big strength in the UK is cabling, which I think anyone that has anything to do with offshore industries in the UK would have been able to guess. But our cable manufacturing industry is huge in the UK, and it's our biggest export market, along with things like helicopters and then services like legal frameworks and financing for offshore. This is just a chart that shows you the growth in that expected market, and again it gives you an insight into how much we're still expecting the sector to ramp up over the next few years, and particularly the infrastructure investment side of this industry. And lastly, because I just like talking about vessels, vessels are actually a really difficult thing for us to track, because many of our companies in the supply chain are servicing more than one market, either renewables markets, so they're working globally, and those vessels operate in different jurisdictions and across different projects. And secondly, they often service the oil and gas sector as well as the renewables industry. So one of our biggest shipping companies in the membership moves 90% of the world's crude oil, but they've built a renewables business worth £90 million in the last 3 years. So it's these are portfolio companies. A really interesting challenge to those big turbines I showed you is my understanding is that at the moment, as it stands, we only have 3 vessels big enough to put them up in the world. And so again, the certainty that we have over our market in the UK is actually a huge asset for our supply chain, because it means that they are much more likely to be able to access kit early enough and book it in when they need it to do the build out of the sites that we're seeing in the pipeline. But yeah, we need bigger boats. There was actually, I mean, it's an inevitable headline, isn't it? But yeah, we're going to need a bigger boat was a headline in the Renewable Energy News last week. There are some policy issues to this rosy future that I'm outlining for you. And they are as follows. So we're in the middle of an energy revolution, and the question I get asked most of the time from the public and from others is, but the wind doesn't blow all the time, so what are you going to do about that? And it's not centralised, so it's more difficult to control as a form of energy infrastructure than, say, big thermal plant that was just here in one place on a centralised architecture. And I just think that discussion is really naive, because the world that I've just described to you with 60% renewables on the system is actually more of a hybrid world with what we have now than people imagine. So bear with me, but this chart here is again a map of all of the energy scenarios that are most credible that we have from National Grid and from the government and from the Committee on Climate Change and others. And what it shows you is 2 things. Firstly, we think that the world will become increasingly decentralised and increasingly decarbonised. So many more suppliers, many more generators, more developers, more companies in the energy space than there ever has been, more business models, more routes to market in more parts of the UK and globally. That's the first lesson from this. But the second and equally important lesson is that even in the most decentralised, most kind of peer-to-peer, consumers leading the system, totally different way of running energy that we can imagine, 50% of our energy generation in the UK is still expected to come from big transmission connected generation, from offshore wind, from nuclear, and from a bit of gas. And so the question for those of us, both from an engineering point of view and from a market design point of view, is not how do you do one world or the other, but how do you invest in both kinds of infrastructure and both kinds of market and do that fairly? And that's the big challenge for the coming decade. The second challenge, and it's related, is that we're putting more and more control over the electricity system into the power of consumers' hands, because as the demand side electrifies, so as we get more electric vehicles on the system and possibly electric heating, and as the system opens up so we have more developers, more suppliers, more business models coming in, we lose less and less, well, we can lose control over matching demand profiles to supply. And this chart here is the nightmare scenario, a bit, of what happens if we don't really invest in our generation in the UK, and particularly renewables, versus lots and lots of electric vehicles coming on in the next decade. And that gap there, that yellow line shows you the demand profile that we're expecting to see over the next decade. The dotted line shows you maximum electric vehicle deployment, and the bit in the middle shows you is a gap between what we can see from between that demand and our expected renewables deployment. And I always say this to industry, but that is our opportunity in the UK, because what this suggests to us is that government is going to have to move to really continue to accelerate the build out of renewables, because that's the bit that they can control to a degree. And secondly, that we'll probably have to do more of it than we think. And the last challenge that we're finding increasingly is that as an established industry, we have a responsibility for more than just low pounds per megawatt hour now. We have a responsibility to build a UK supply chain, to invest in UK jobs, and to invest in local communities. And most of the conversations I have with politicians now, and in fact with industry, is less about how do we get our costs down, and more about how do we continue to get our costs down whilst investing in the wider value of the industry for this country, including, is it worth that pounds per megawatt hour kind of downward trajectory, going less quickly in order to make sure we're getting, say, regional GVA, because we're investing in jobs or in regions here. Is it worth that pounds per megawatt hour conversation being on hold for a while we talk about UK content and how we deliver that 60% UK content commitment in the offshore wind sector deal? And it's a much richer, much more infrastructure-based conversation than ones that we've had for the last 5 years, where again, renewables technologies were seen in this kind of, it's only about energy policy vacuum. This map, by the way, I've stolen directly from the offshore wind sector deal. And this is just, lastly, and most importantly, what happens next, which is, and I've just touched upon it, but for us as an industry, we have to prepare you all, supply chain and market both, for what's coming next. And it seems to us that the big change over the next decade will be this opening up of other energy markets on the demand side of energy, so that what happens with heat electrification, whether we end up doing hydrogen, how we source that hydrogen, for example, through electrolysis or not, what happens with cities and how they go green and when and where, and the kind of targets they put on, and the same with local authorities, how we decarbonise our agriculture. All of that change and technology change will impact what we're doing on the supply side. And it will also create opportunities for UK companies. And that is fundamentally going to change business models. We've already seen the kind of vertically integrated utility model changing, so how we invest and develop new industries changing. But we're going to definitely see it in where the value is in the market. So going forward, for example, if we do deploy lots of EVs, which is this electrification bit in orange on this chart, then huge numbers of other markets are opened up by the presence of that technology on the system. In the same way as having more small-scale batteries on the system opens up other markets as well. And what you'll see from this is batteries are valuable a bit, and so are EVs, and being able to balance out renewables and just literally store energy, and that will be a paid-for service. But what is really valuable, what we think will be really valuable by 2030, is the ability to provide flexible energy services, ancillary services, balancing services, and things like vehicle to grid. Now, I'm telling you all of this because increasingly our big developers, our offshore wind developers, are looking, yes, on the one hand at our supply chain and that set of values and kind of investing there and continuing to do their traditional business model, but many of them are now looking at other vectors in energy. So can they do things like electrolysis and add another revenue stream to their business? Can they co-locate with a battery and add another revenue stream to that project? And again, that is going to diversify and enrich the supply chain and all of the operations and logistics we put around the industry around the UK as these markets come alive. This, by the way, is a back of the fag packet calculation my economist did for me on the value of peak demand by 2030, and she will murder me if you think that it is, you know, an absolute, a really established bit of analysis that you should definitely take away to your boards. It isn't, but it is a good illustration of it's not the EV or it's not the wind turbine, it's the markets they create that we think are going to be interesting and what that will do to the whole sector. And lastly, and I apologise, but it is sort of inevitable that I would say this, but we have a responsibility as the industry to do things better than we did in the past. And that I say that with a commercial hat on, which is, I don't know if you've spoken to the average 23-year-old graduate lately, but they have expectations about their working environment that just would not have been there 10 years ago, including do you take climate change seriously? But also, does your workforce look like them? Is it somewhere which is diverse? Does it offer them flexible working? Is it a kind of better work-life balance? And some of that is a bit, you know, they might have that bashed out of them after 10 years in industry, but some of it is also that we need to look like an aspirational sector, because that tends to be how people think of us. And kind of tell you how many conversations I've had with particularly young women who are then crushed when they realise that the industry isn't this kind of green, mission-led, different sector to the one that they have in their heads. And so I think being alive to that as organisations is really important. For what it's worth, and between you and I, the sector deal would not have been signed by government if the industry hadn't made very strong diversity commitments in it. So the offshore wind industry only got a deal with government by committing to increasing its workforce to at least a third women by 2030, for example, and setting targets around black and minority ethnic diversity too. And then on top of that, there is a commercial risk to this, which is our members that work in oil and gas tell us that they are increasingly getting particularly graduate engineers, who want to work in their renewables businesses, who want to work on the kind of low carbon bit of their business, or kind of won't take a contract with them if they're working only on fossil fuels. And I think that is fascinating and a real risk for our supply chain member companies that don't get into the decarbonisation transition fast enough. And the last thing to say is that world I described to you, where the whole market is changing, where we're going to be facing competition from lots of new market entrants and from lots of participants that we don't think of as being traditional energy companies, means we're in increased competition for a skilled workforce. You know, I sit on the board of the Grantham Institute at Imperial College and on the Energy Futures Lab board, and they tell me that their graduates, their energy engineers and graduates are more often than not poached by the city rather than by this sector, because those skills are now required by more than one industry. And I think that's fascinating, and again, all the more reason to get ahead of the other stuff that we can offer as an industry before we lose the skills and the workforce that we need to get the job done. Those are my contact details. I have whizzed through quite a big picture for the industry and the sector, so if there's anything I've missed and you don't ask today, this is how you can find me. And again, I have a much more skilled and knowledgeable team sitting not that far from here who can answer any technical questions or anything I can't answer today. And I'm going to open up for questions.
Thank you, Emma, that was great. I thought it was really insightful and really interesting, and it's so heartening and warming to know that sort of the communities that were deprived are now being invested in.
Yeah.
And it just shows what progress is happening. Any questions? I have one.
Yeah.
Well, I have several. One of them, you're talking about the electrification of the transport sector. And I was at the European Renewables conference the other week, and they were talking about cabling and how we could get the cables from the offshore wind farms and plug them directly into the city, so then you can just top up your cars and things. And it just fascinated me. It was obviously there's a lot of logistics behind that and design. What are your thoughts on that?
That is a new one, I have to confess. So what I do think is that the industry developers of projects, especially offshore wind projects, are now looking at how they can directly access the markets and provide other services. So that started with storage, like they're co-locating batteries rather than having them somewhere else in the system. They want them on site. There's a big conversation going on about if we do things like hydrogen or electrolysis, where you would locate that, and some of the developers moving again to have that kind of infrastructure on site and possibly offshore. And all of that requires a different kind of cabling, different kind of infrastructure. And so, yeah, it's not out of the realms of the possibility that you would get direct wire kind of arrangements for cities to be purchasing power from offshore wind farms to run their other infrastructure. That I've come from a conversation with City Hall about direct wire PPAs and about how they might do that. However, the one thing I would say is in order to keep costs low, you have to build projects where they're most efficient. And if we're talking about offshore wind, one of the things we're expecting to see is moving into deeper water. So more cabling costs on projects because we're going further out to sea. And so therefore kind of extending a cable in the opposite direction to do something else. If you're not getting the market benefit of that back, if it's very expensive to do, I think then that might be prohibitive. And also, matching where the demand is with the suppliers and that kind of direct arrangement can be tricky. And in Germany, for example, a lot of their best, I think you probably all know this, but a lot of their best renewables resource is in the north of the country, and they need to move it to the south because that's where a lot of their industry is. So they have to rely on things like interconnectors. Again, that's really good news if you happen to be a cable manufacturer in the UK, because it's not just we're going to have to work out how to move things over quite long distances. I would expect. Yeah.
As you mentioned, what an opportunity for the industry.
Yeah.
There's so much opportunity for growth and investment, and it's just a matter of us getting up to speed and delivering in line with the need of our consumers. Do you have any questions on the live stream?
Yes. So, do you think the offshore sector deal will fill the expected gap? In one of your questions. And do you have any comments on the potential for floating wind in the UK?
Oh yeah, floating's cool. I'll come on to floating in a second. So on the offshore wind sector deal, so that gap that I'm assuming we're talking about the gap between EVs and current renewables production. No, because that renewables pipeline is the stuff we can see, which includes, we can already see that we should be able to do 30 gigawatts by 2030. So the biggest risk in terms of demand management over the next decade is actually the repowering of onshore wind, and whether we do anything to invest in our onshore wind fleet, because some of that gap is created by onshore wind coming off the system rather than new build. We have no policy and no route to market for onshore wind, so that's something of a problem. I think offshore wind is going to do more. This is a personal reflection, not an industry target. I think offshore wind will comfortably do 30 gigawatts by 2030 with the budget that we've got from the auctions. So some of that gap will close, but the sector deal is not the driver for that. That will be again, technology innovation and what the industry can do for 557 million quid. If you're worried about that gap at all, do feel free to write to an MP and point out that we need onshore wind to keep the lights on. Floating, yes. So we have a floating wind task force. I think that's what we're calling it at RenewableUK. And a kind of interesting reflection on floating wind. We also run a big event on floating wind every year we have done since I've been at the organisation, which is over 2 years now. And 2 years ago, when we were talking about floating wind, there was a lot of, especially from the incumbent fixed bottom offshore wind developers, and actually from many others in industry who just thought it was a technology that would never get away. What has changed is two things. Firstly, we can see we're going to have to go into deeper water, even in the UK. And understanding what the project costs are of fixed bottom in deep water has become clearer, which means that the costs of floating look different. Secondly, that the floating costs look like they're going to come down quicker than we thought because we have a better understanding of the kinds of technologies. Thirdly, that we've got some very big market players interested in floating. Many of those are extractives companies because they're interested in floating for multiple applications, so as a form of energy generation in its own right, but also to help them green and supply their offshore rigs as a kind of transition technology. Yeah, it's fascinating. And lastly, that most markets in the world do not have our seabed. So what we have demonstrated over the last 2 years is that offshore wind is hugely efficient and a very reliable form of energy infrastructure, which has a big supply chain benefit to it, and countries are therefore interested in it. But most countries do not have the same flat sea and relatively accessible seabed that we do, and our deeper water, so they are very interested in floating technology. The UK has 2 sites that are in development for floating and many companies that are interested in investing here, so it's critical they have a route to market if government wants the technology, which is why we have a task force trying to work with government to establish what that is. Yeah.
How exciting! So exciting.
Yeah.
I like the name Task Force. It's very
Yeah.
action plan.
I've got several. In the future, post 2030, is there potential for the UK to export electricity to mainland Europe where there is less renewable potential?
Yeah, it's so on the export, absolutely. If you just map the amount of generation that we think we're going to have and the amount of renewable potential that we have in the UK versus what Europe has, yes. There are 2 models for that. One is actually that there's a group of countries in the North Sea, so the kind of North Sea countries, who are very interested in thinking about how we can do shared development of some of that deeper water offshore wind, because it will become closer to several national borders at that point. There's been talk of things like an energy island out in the North Sea. Anyway, this is very hypothetical stuff, but just to illustrate that conversation is happening, we're starting to think about strategically planning in where those projects are and that kind of infrastructure in a cross-country way. But the second thing is to say that regardless of that more abstract idea, we will need interconnection investment. So one of those models I showed you about decarbonisation hinge on there being another, I think it's 9.6, maybe 8.6, around 9 gigawatts of new interconnection capacity coming online in the next decade-ish. Between us and the continent, largely. I think there's maybe an additional Irish interconnector. If we have that infrastructure, we should be able to export. But in terms of the amount of renewables that we will have here, we will have, we think, net renewable generation a lot of the time. The last thing to say is that will happen also if the markets enable it. So if it's got a revenue stream attached to it and we have the infrastructure attached, utilities will do it and developers will do it. However, if we bring storage online, there is an alternative that says we may choose to store excess generation in the UK and then sell it back to the grid when it's profitable to do so. So again, the sort of picture we're creating is an asset with lots and lots of different markets attached and different services in the system attached, and that's one of the things that's exciting about our renewables potential instead of a very traditional energy asset.
And can storage be improved to a point where, I suppose, to match the demand which can't be covered by renewables? Yeah,
so there's lots of kinds of storage. I think that's also always worth saying, especially to engineers who get really annoyed about all the chat about batteries. We look at all kinds of storage at RenewableUK and its potential for system balancing, from the kind of mad and very small, like using electric vehicles to store and distribute load, through to things like hydrogen on the system, or traditional hydro, to be honest. So all of the above. However, what is interesting is that the technology change in batteries is driving new business models where people are doing things like co-location, where they want to develop batteries and wind. And there are a couple of projects now where we've got offshore wind plus batteries. So this model works better at the moment, or comes out of the onshore wind industry first, for lots of obvious logistical reasons and size of battery reasons, but we're starting to see it in the offshore wind industry. There are projects in Norway which combine offshore wind and batteries, and we have one in the UK called Batwind, which I think, this industry, by the way, is excellent at naming things. That's something I expect, a market I expect to see picking up, yeah.
Okay.
On the system challenge, there is one big hole in system operation, and it's only one. Every other concern we've had with variable renewables has been dealt with. But eventually, in a world where we are 50 or 60% led by variable renewables and predominantly wind, we still have an issue with that, with interseasonal storage. So that's the kind of storage that I'm most interested in, and we don't have a full solution for. And in particular, there is that, what happens if we have 2 weeks of absolutely no wind? Now, largely, they don't happen often, and we can usually manage it because we believe in an electricity mix, but I'm very interested in forms of storage that can come forward to sort that problem out. Until that happens, RenewableUK and the renewables industry don't usually argue for a 100% renewables pathway. So there's lots of conversation about can we go to 100% renewables, and there's lots of models out there that suggest that you can in theory, but in practice it's the interseasonal storage bit that we're concerned by. And so until that's fixed, we go all the way up to like 70-80% renewables, and then we say that there's going to be a couple of engineering problems we need to fix. Yeah.
At what point do we get to 70-80% renewables, and then we have to find a solution?
So we panic. Not for a while. So I'm talking about. So we're looking at the 2-degree scenario, and the kind of current pathways are for around 50% of electricity generation, 50 to 60 coming from renewables by 2030. I think that is more than possible. So incumbency by 2030, no question. Any serious energy analyst will tell you that. Assuming that we do build the onshore wind that we can build. So assuming we build the stuff we can build, that's what we'll be at. The 65%, 70% plus thing will happen in the 2030s, and it will be mid to late 2030s, depending on technology innovation, storage coming online, grid sorting itself out, how fast EVs deploy, all of that. So the barriers to that percentage are no longer about the technologies, they're about the wider system change, and of course there's so many moving parts in that it's quite hard to put a specific date on it. For what it's worth, we are going to try and put a specific date on it. So RenewableUK is doing a big piece of work on what does the sector believe is possible for that kind of world, and when. So what does 2035-ish look like? There is one more contingency worth mentioning, which is from a UK content point of view, that kind of ramp up, the kind of ramp up we're seeing in, say, the Labour government commitments that came out this morning, or what 1.5 degrees looks like according to the CCC. So that's 70 to 90 gigawatts of renewables by 2050. For that kind of ramp up, there is a question about whether the supply chain can keep up, and how we make sure we get our supply chain to match the kind of development side of things. Because I don't yet know whether we can. So that again, it's that tension between the carbon pounds per megawatt hour and investment in UK content, and the supply chain is delicately held balance. So kind of the new trilemma in this stuff. That's what we're trying to balance up. So I don't know that is necessarily a problem, but I'm saying that that's one that we do have to look at for how quickly will that percentage change. Yeah.
And I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to limit this to just one more question. If that's it.
I have one. Have you got some?
Yeah, go.
I have 2 questions. I'll make them quick answers.
You mentioned like a cultural connection earlier
Yeah.
about people wanting to work in renewables, and wanting to work in companies that did renewables. Last year, when the government did its study for what's going to be the next round of offshore wind, I think they started with something like 40 sites, which got whittled down to 4. Mostly, it seems, in the report, down to people on the south coast complaining they don't want windmills to look at. And nothing else. Nothing to do with grid connections or technology or workforces, but purely not in my backyard people. Is that changing at all? Have you got any insight into how that's looking? Because that's what's holding a huge tract of offshore wind land.
So yes and no. So definitely the kind of community feeling is part of it with why sites don't go ahead. There's also, and again, there's going to be some. We're going to have to less having our cake and eating it, I think, at government level with which benefits we prioritise, and by that I mean things like balancing, making sure there's access for all different kinds of industries to particular bits of the seabed, environmental protections and community wishes is really hard to do. So those sites do get kind of really rapidly cut down. That said, we think we've got enough sites to deliver the portfolio. On the people bit...
But the portfolio is considerably smaller than the previous portfolio.
Yes, but we need less space. So the other good thing about technology innovation is that we're doing fewer turbines equals more power.
Right.
So for example, that £557 million, and also we need less money. So £557 million worth of investment from government should deliver us all the capacity that we think we need. When that number came out, everyone was like, the fewer bigger turbines, cheaper, but also less space. On the people, much of my career has been not what we've got, but how we sell it. So nothing to do with engineering constraints, nothing to do with the kind of physics of the grid, and everything to do with how people feel. And I say this to our companies all the time, but you will need a workforce that understands people and how people feel about projects, as well as people that can plan your projects for you and do the engineering. Because that community sentiment has been make or break in the UK. Now, we haven't seen it for offshore wind in the UK. So if you're worried about that in offshore wind, the good news is that largely coastal communities are used to having infrastructure there, so they're all used to having industry there. And that's the first good thing. The second thing is they desperately want the jobs and the growth, and they understand that now because we've seen it as a really strong argument. And thirdly...
Not in Cornwall,
but the kind of predominant bit of development, at least in the first stage, will be up the northeast. And interestingly, in Cornwall, where there's lots of wave and tidal development, that seems to be really popular with the public. So the third thing is about values, which is, this is a very weird anecdote. Apparently, my immediate colleague in France has the problem that I have with onshore wind development with offshore wind. And the reason is, in France, the population as a whole, while the kind of communities are romantic about their coastline, so it's the kind of Côte d'Azur, that image of France, they kind of, there's something cultural about the view they have of their coastlines. Whereas in the UK, we're romantic in a kind of Wordsworth way about our rolling hills. And so that people get very exercised about onshore wind turbines in the UK, but we've generally had much less political and public opposition to offshore. Onshore wind in the UK is banned entirely because of local community opposition, actually weirdly in parts of the UK where we were never going to build it, really. So yeah, that's a huge part of the conversation, and again I think industry really needs to be alive to it. And just lastly on this, industry has got better at it. So development 10 years ago I think was much more top-down, much less engaged with communities, much less wise about having to talk about the wider value case of this stuff. And in the way the automotive sector or the aviation industry or others do, we have got much better at talking to people about the wider value of this industry beyond just it being a climate change technology. So yeah, but we will see. If we start carpeting the North Sea and wind turbines, I might start seeing some objections to offshore. But generally it's been less virulent than for onshore. By the way, the reason for Cornwall is probably, if we are sentimental about our coastlines in the UK, it's the Cornish coast, I think, that everyone romanticises, maybe. So there's the kind of, do not underestimate that sentiment as a developer.
I find it interesting because I come from Liverpool.
Oh, yeah.
And I get the feeling that oh, the Scousers won't care what the coastline looks like. Let's put 200 windmills there. They don't know any different. They don't have any culture. You know.
I don't think it's that.
Us Southerners, no, we want our coastline. We'll keep it.
But I think the difference is that the South has been. So yes, I think that everyone cares about infrastructure in their backyards. Like everyone does. Like even I. You know, like which one of us goes home and thinks that we wouldn't have a problem with that, or wouldn't kind of want to know what the value of a housing estate down the road was, or that pylon, or you know, we all have that immediate visceral like change in our own neighbourhoods. But the difference is that for many people, they understand the wider value proposition, and you kind of go, no, I see why houses are necessary so that anyone under the age of 35 can buy a home. So maybe I need to get over it. And I think with my experience of working with communities around the UK. Is that good for the East Coast and good for the North? Is they are much more used to industry, and they understand that
yes, they are.
Is a equation which will pay back to them and that's valuable to them. Yeah.
Last question. It's the dreaded B word.
Brexit. Is it Brexit? Oh yeah. We did so well, everyone.
I thought we banned that word in these meetings.
What impact do you think that Brexit will have on the near future of offshore wind energy and are plans being made to allow deals, etc., with the EU countries to continue?
So as an organisation, we're actually, I haven't pulled the membership lately, so maybe this will have changed over the last year, but politically we're neutral because actually many of our supply chain companies and others around the UK think that there could be a stronger market for them in the UK outside the EU, or for whatever reason. So we had a split membership on whether membership of the EU in general was an in or out one. However, what is clear is that a no-deal Brexit will drastically affect this industry in the way that it would do every other sector. So things like how we, from trading of electrons, trading of pounds, and trading and moving components of people across borders, there are real impacts if we don't have some kind of agreement that allows that to happen. In the long term, we might figure that out. In the short term, the risk is actually to the 6 gigawatts-ish of offshore wind that's building out in the next 2 years. And the reason for that is, if you're a project that has a CFD attached to it in the UK, you have milestone delivery dates and they are vicious. You know, you have to deliver X amount of your project value by a certain date in order to qualify for your CFD payment at the end. And interestingly, there is a clause in the CFD legislation where if policy or government change impacts your ability as a developer to do that, you can reclaim your CFD or the costs from government. So that's a bit that you can see that something which say slows down components at borders or labour not being able to get into the country could impact on your ability to meet milestone delivery dates, could impact on your CFD now. So that's the one that we're tracking. For what it's worth, I'm not hearing any urgent, this is the kind of immediate problem stuff yet. But that is where the risk will be. And again, that cost reduction has been because we've got really slick at doing it, and we have booked in things like the right vessels that we need at the right time, and the right components coming in at the right time. And someone said to me the other day, you know, the issue is that you can't really stockpile something like a wind turbine blade. There are as many of them as there are. And we do make some of them in this country, but obviously we need to get them across borders too. So it's big bits of kit and uncertainty. So thank you for allowing us to finish on that cheery note.
All right, thank you so much,
You're
Emma,
very
for
welcome.
coming
Thank you for
today
having me.
and for presenting. I'm sure on behalf of everyone we've been enthralled and really delighted to hear about the status of renewables in the UK and the master plan going forward. You've been terribly fun and exciting that we still have loads of questions left over.
Okay.
So if it's all right to
Think about that.
follow up.
You can also, please don't troll me on Twitter because I get enough of that. I got a death threat this week, that was fun, from someone that didn't like onshore wind turbines. You can find me on Twitter at EL Pinchbeck and ask me things directly there, but also, you know,
Sure.
feel free, and you guys feel free to email me over anything and we'll answer questions.
Perfect. Okay, let's wrap up there.
Thanks.
Thank you.